There's arguably no piece of advice more common for people with heart rhythm issue than this: cut the caffeine. Whether you have the occasional palpitation, or you've been diagnosed with atrial fibrillation, or you're just worried about your heart health, the conventional wisdom has always been that coffee is enemy number one. And it makes sense, right? Caffeine is a stimulant, AFib is an irregular heart rhythm. Why would you pour fuel on the fire? But here's the thing: what if that advice is actually wrong? What if stopping your daily coffee habit isn't just unnecessary suffering, but actually making your heart less stable? A brand new randomized controlled trial called the DECAF Trial, wonderful name by the way, just challenges dogma in a massive way. And the results were pretty striking. We're talking about a 39% lower risk of AFib recurrence in the people who kept drinking their morning coffee compared to those who quit. So today we're going to go through and separate the internet lore from the medical reality. We're going to break down this exact study, what was done, why a stimulant might actually be protective for the heart, and whether you actually need to change your morning routine. Let's dive in. So first and foremost, we have to address the elephant in the room, which is the conventional wisdom, right? So for decades, doctors, including myself, have often operated on the assumption that caffeinated coffee is pro-arrhythmic, meaning it causes abnormal heart rhythms in your heart. It increases the sympathetic tone, it can raise your blood pressure, and patients often report that they feel like it triggers them. And so because of that, the standard of care has often been to play it safe and tell people to abstain from caffeine. But because I'm a nerd, I wanted to look through the data. And for years, the large-scale observational studies have shown this weird protective signal, right? Time and time again, we see that habitual coffee drinkers don't actually have high rates of AFib. They often have lower rates. But we couldn't necessarily trust that, right? We thought maybe there's a healthy user bias, maybe people who drink coffee just exercise more, or maybe the people who get palpitations naturally stop drinking coffee, so the ones left drinking are the ones with iron hearts, who pretty much you can do anything to them and it won't matter. So we needed a real experiment to know for sure, and so we needed a randomized controlled trial, and that's exactly what the DECAF trial gave us. So let's take a step back and look at how they set this up, because the design is crucial, right? They took 200 patients who were habitual coffee drinkers, meaning they normally had coffee. And here's the important nuance here. These weren't just random people, right? They had atrial fibrillation or atrial flutter. So they had to have that, and they were scheduled for an electrical cardioversion. All this means that their hearts were out of rhythm, right? And the plan was for them to go to the hospital and get their heart shocked back into a normal rhythm. And with these people, this is a high stakes population. We know that recurrence rates are pretty high. We can have a sometimes 50% recurrence or going back to that abnormal rhythm within 6 months. So if coffee was going to be a trigger, this is the group where we would see it. Once these patients were successfully shocked back into the normal rhythm, they were randomized into two groups. First, we had the consumption group. These folks were told to keep drinking their caffeinated coffee, aiming at about 1 cup per day at least. Then we had the abstinence group. These folks were told to stop completely. No coffee, no caffeine. And then they watched both these groups for 6 months to see whose AFib came back. And so what happened? Well, if you follow the old school advice, you'd expect the coffee drinkers to be jittery and their hearts to go back into AFib faster. But the data showed the exact opposite, actually. In the abstinence group, the people who quit, 64% had a recurrence of the arrhythmia. But in the coffee consumption group, only 47% had a recurrence. And when you crunch the numbers, that is a hazard ratio of 0.61. And you might be like, Jordan, what does that mean in real life? Well, that's a 39% lower risk of having your AFib come back just by continuing to drink your coffee. Now let's take a look at this chart right here. This is something called a Kaplan-Meier curve, which shows the probability of an event over time. A lot of time this is used to look at mortality, but we can look at it for a bunch of different things. On the y-axis, we have the probability of recurrence, meaning the probability of your AFib or atrial flutter coming back. And on the x-axis, you have the days of follow-up, so how long we have follow-up there. You can see the lines separate almost immediately. So this means that the people drinking coffee stayed in normal rhythm longer and more often than the people who quit. And you can see this divergence, and this divergence really kind of shows us that, hey, there's a real signal going on here. It's not just kind of, oh, maybe it's happening, but no, they're showing that, hey, definitively, we see these people who continue to drink coffee had better outcomes long-term. And so this kind of brings up the obvious question: why is this happening? How on earth is a stimulant protective against something like AFib? It seems counterintuitive, but there are a few possible plausible mechanisms we're going to talk about. The first proposed mechanism has to do with something called adenosine. And we know that caffeine blocks adenosine receptors in the body. And adenosine is a chemical that in the heart can actually shorten something called the refractory period of the atrium. So refractory period just means how long does it take until your heart is ready to pump again. And adenosine in the heart muscle, it makes it ready to fire too quickly, which could potentially facilitate AFib. So by blocking these adenosine receptors, caffeine might actually be preventing the heart from being too twitchy. The second mechanism is inflammation, and we blame pretty much everything on inflammation, and this is no different. But coffee is packed with biological compounds that have known anti-inflammatory properties. So the idea is that because we know that inflammation could drive AFib, these chronic anti-inflammatory effects of coffee may be helping stabilize the heart some way. And finally, there's the behavioral factor. The researchers pointed to a previous study called the CRAVE trial, which showed that people who drink coffee tend to have about 1,000 more steps per day than non-coffee drinkers. And physical activity is one of the best drugs we currently have for preventing AFib. So it's possible that coffee gives these patients just enough energy to be a little more active, which is actually protecting their hearts. But, and there's always a but, we have to apply some nuance here, right? I don't want you to hear this and think that coffee is just a magic cure-all. There were definitely some limitations we need to talk about. The first limitation is selection bias. So in this study, they screened nearly 2,000 people just to find 200 people who were willing to participate. A huge chunk of these people were excluded because they refused to quit coffee. Essentially, they just said, no, it's not worth it. I love my coffee. I'm not going to do that. Or the other reason, and this is key, is that they refused to drink it because they knew that it triggered them. So they're saying, hey, if I drink this, I'm going to go back into AFib or it's going to give me palpitations. So they excluded all those people. And so if you're someone who drinks a cup of coffee and immediately goes into AFib or heart rhythm, please listen to your body. Do not listen to me. I'm just a random dude on the internet. Please do not do that. You're definitely an N of one. And this research experiment does not talk about you, right? It does not apply to you. So do not force yourself to drink it just because the study said so. This study looked at people who were already proven to be coffee tolerant. Second, this was a study on continuation, not initiation, right? So these patients were already coffee drinkers. We aren't telling people who hate coffee to start chugging espressos for heart health. That's not what I'm saying. And lastly, we're also talking about coffee specifically, not energy drinks or caffeine pills. Coffee has a complex matrix of antioxidants and different compounds that you don't get in sugar energy drinks, so we can't just extrapolate this to any sort of caffeine. So what does this actually mean for you? Well, here are the takeaways. If you have AFib and you enjoy your morning coffee and you don't feel like it triggers symptoms, you likely don't need to stop. In fact, the stress of withdrawal and the loss of your daily ritual might be worse for your heart than the caffeine itself. And we really want to focus on the big rocks, right? So we talk about sleep, diet, alcohol cessation, exercise, weight management, all those big things. These move the needle. Demonizing a bean that brings you joy, that's probably not worth the energy. As always, I'm just some dude on the internet, so make sure you talk about this with your doctor if you do have AFib or are concerned about this, but hopefully this makes you feel a little more confident that your daily coffee isn't ruining your heart. And if you like this video, YouTube thinks you'll like this one as well.